with your host, Steve Gruber.
All right, welcome back to the nation's capital. On assignment here this week at Washington, D.C. Been here for the weekend, Ivy and I. A lot to tell you about there, but let's start with this. I got three big things for you this hour. We're going to talk about D.C. here in a second, but here are three big things this hour, and I'm not feeling well today, so bear with me if we have a couple of hiccups along the way, all right? Number one, a group is pushing for an I-73 corridor, right? I-73. There's no such thing as I-73, but these folks would like it to run from the Upper Peninsula to South Carolina. So it'd be a great alleyway for those escaping hurricanes and so forth. Number two, Kilmar Abrego Garcia, to appear at an ICE office in Baltimore mid-talk of an Uganda deportation. That's going to happen today. And number three, I start here today from Michigan News Source. From Michigan News Source, I have this. Forget science. The Detroit media says Trump derangement syndrome is 100% real and justified. No, Trump derangement syndrome is not a clinically recognized mental health disorder. It doesn't show up in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM-5, the gold standard for psychiatric conditions published by the American Psychiatric Association, APA. However, the media company Detroit Metro Times says it's real. In their report, yes, Trump derangement syndrome is a real thing, says journalist Joe LaPointe. Trump derangement syndrome is a valid and logical reaction to the deranged behavior of President Donald Trump, he writes. He's a dangerous buffoon, and his second term in the White House may be worse than his first. LaPointe went on to write, I didn't really believe that there was such a thing as Trump derangement syndrome. Hatred of President Trump so intense that it impairs people's judgment. It's not that I didn't notice the harsh, unyielding language against him. I've said a few tough things myself, but throughout the campaign, Trump seemed to do things that justified it. However, the therapy group of D.C. says the TDS is a partisan insult, not a psychiatric diagnosis. In other words, if you storm into a psychiatrist's office ranting about Trump's latest comments on Truth Social, the fact that he's trying to destroy democracy, don't expect Blue Cross to cover your TDS treatments. The term TDS, widely dismissed by mental health professionals, is nothing more than political shorthand, a catch-all insult coined by Trump supporters and others who look on in disbelief as Democrats melt down on TikTok, pound podiums at rallies, or deliver Senate floor rants predicting democracy's imminent collapse after every move the president makes. In theory, lawmakers are supposed to represent their constituents with a dose of pragmatism and common sense, guided by facts and basic decency. But for those trapped in the grip of TDS, the rulebook seems to have only one entry. If Trump does it, it must be bad, period. Even while negotiating peace between Ukraine and Russia, Democrats raged on social media, claiming it was all just a distraction because Trump's name was supposedly lurking in the so-called Epstein files. CNN's Fareed Zakaria once defined TDS as hatred of President Trump so intense that it impairs people's judgment. That's not a diagnostic test, but it does explain half the cable news commentary since 2016, of which he's been a big part, and the current state of affairs on social media by both elected Democrats and their supporters. It's a syndrome with a pedigree. Well, sort of. The phrase Trump derangement syndrome wasn't some new concept that popped up when Trump entered politics and became a presidential candidate. Back in 2003, conservative columnist and Harvard-trained psychiatrist Charles Krauthammer coined Bush derangement syndrome to mock what he saw as the irrational fury directed at George W. Bush. The Trump version was inevitable, just with the volume knob broken off after being cranked to 11. I always turn it to 11, but it only goes to 10. I always turn it to 11. A new Spinal Tap movie coming, by the way, just quick aside. Some politicians have decided to take the moniker seriously. In March 2025, a group of Minnesota Republican senators introduced a bill to classify TDS as a mental illness. Their definition, the acute onset of paranoia in otherwise normal persons that is in reaction to the policies and presidencies of President Donald J. Trump. Symptoms may include Trump-induced general hysteria, which produces an inability to distinguish between legitimate policy differences and signs of psychic pathology in President Donald J. Trump's behavior. The bill says the TDS can be expressed by verbal expressions of intense hostility toward the president or even overt acts of aggression and violence against anyone supporting Trump or anything that symbolizes him. Critics quickly responded with pushback. Minnesota's Democrat Senator Majority Leader Aaron Murphy called the bill wasteful, frivolous, and shameful. The worst bill in Minnesota history, she said. The irony is hard to miss. The very experts wagging their fingers about supposed instability were themselves engaging in what looks an awful lot like collective meltdown. If psychiatrists trained to keep cool heads were penning frantic open letters warning of impending doom, maybe TDS doesn't affect just your uncle at Thanksgiving. Maybe it really does turn even the so-called experts into case studies. Did you think about that? In a Psychology Today article from September 24, titled The Paradox of Trump Derangement Syndrome, writer Alex Patakis, PhD, described how those inflicted with a toxic fixation and negative reaction to Donald Trump can find calmness. He says that by the freedom of will and deliberately choosing an attitude in response rather than reacting automatically, Trump haters can regain their personal agency, reduce stress, and align their actions with meaningful values and goals. The question is, after approximately 10 years being mired in TDS, can they change, and do they even want to? Do they even want to? Yeah. Even psychiatrists fall prey. If you needed proof that TDS isn't a recognized diagnosis, but maybe should be, take a look at the professionals who've tied themselves in knots over it. Back in 2017, more than 30 psychiatrists and psychologists signed a letter to the New York Times insisting Donald Trump was too mentally unstable to serve as president. They claimed his grave emotional instability made him incapable of serving safely as president. In other words, they broke their own profession's Goldwater rule, their ethical guideline against diagnosing public figures from afar, because they couldn't resist playing armchair psychiatrist on the biggest stage possible in order to get rid of a political figure they didn't like. They didn't like. Look, I don't know. There are people afflicted with TDS. Is it clinical? It's something. It's something, my friends. I'm in Washington, and I can tell you it's to be found here pretty easily. These folks will attack Donald Trump for putting more police and law enforcement on the streets to make the city safer. That's a terrible thing. It's a federal takeover of D.C. Good. It needed one. The place was full of homeless people and had 200 murders a year, sometimes 300. Maybe it's time to clean the place up. Maybe it's time to try something different. Maybe it's time to give him a chance, but that didn't work. Anyhow, what are your thoughts? Make sure you drop me a line, stevegruber.com. Send me a note. Tell me your thoughts. What's going on in that head of yours? I'll take a break and be back. It's the Steve Gruber Show.